Hello everyone. Tonight we're beginning with a story about how prisoners were treated inside the Tower of London. Not as you see in the films, but as it truly was. The silence, the stone, the slow turning of years behind locked doors. If you enjoy stories like this, please give it a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. And write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a quiet fan, just for that soft background hum. And let's take this night journey together. I am old now, and the sound of water troubles me. I cannot hear the Thames without remembering the weight of it, how it moved past those grey walls, carrying things away that no one was meant to speak of. My name is Richard Ashford, and I spent 32 years as a warden of the Tower of London during the reign of Henry VIII and the early years of his daughter Elizabeth. I'm writing this in my final years, in a small room near the coast, where I've come to live far from the city and far from memory, though memory has followed me regardless. You will want to know what I did there. You will want to know if I was the kind of man who participated in what happened, or if I was simply someone who witnessed it. I cannot give you a clean answer to this question, because I no longer know where the line between witnessing and participating actually lies. I was there. I kept the keys. I walked the halls. I knew the prisoners' names. That much makes me complicit, even if I never personally inflicted the harm that was inflicted. But I should begin with how I came to that place, because you cannot understand what the Tower was without understanding the kind of men it required to maintain it. I was the son of a locksmith and a merchant's daughter. My father had made his living fashioning locks and keys for the wealthy households of London, a skilled trade that kept us comfortable, though never wealthy. My mother came from a family with connections to the royal household, distant connections, but connections nonetheless. It was through her uncle that I learned of a position opening at the Tower. A man was needed who understood locks and keys, who was literate enough to keep records, who was trustworthy enough to be given responsibility for prisoners of high value. I was 19 years old when I first passed through the great gates. This was in the year 1518, during the height of the king's power, before the break with Rome, before the religious upheavals that would come to define his reign. The Tower stood as it had for centuries a fortress within the city, a place separate from London's chaos and commerce. The walls were massive beyond what you might imagine. Centuries of stone, laid by masons whose names no one remembered, had created something that seemed to exist outside of time. The weight of those walls was the first thing you felt when you entered. It pressed down on you, entered through your skin, settled into your bones. The constable of the Tower at that time was a man named Sir John Touchet, a competent administrator who had learned that the business of managing prisoners was largely a matter of preventing trouble rather than causing it. He received me with courtesy and explained my duties with precision. I was to maintain records of all prisoners, noting their arrival date, their status, the reason for their imprisonment, and the conditions of their confinement. I was to ensure that the locks and chains remained in working order. I was to be present during the admission of prisoners and to observe their treatment. I was not, under any circumstances, to form attachments or sympathies with those imprisoned. Loyalty to the Crown was paramount. I understood then, though only dimly, that I was being given an education in complicity. I was being taught that the business of imprisonment required a particular kind of man. Not a cruel man, necessarily, but a man who could accept the premise that those who found themselves in the Tower were there for reasons beyond question, that their suffering was a necessary component of a larger order, that compassion for them was a luxury that responsible men could not afford. My first weeks in the Tower were spent learning its geography. This is important, because the Tower was not simply a building. It was a labyrinth, a collection of towers and walls and chambers that had evolved over centuries as different rulers added to it or modified it according to their needs. There was the White Tower, the oldest structure, massive and brooding, which contained chambers and dungeons that descended deep into the earth. There were the walls that ran around the perimeter, with towers positioned at intervals, the Beauchamp Tower, the Bell Tower, the Bloody Tower, though that last name was not used then, at least not officially. There was the lieutenant's lodging, where the senior officers lived. There were the barracks where the guard was housed, there were storage chambers, armories, chapels, and there were the places where prisoners were held, rooms that ranged from relatively comfortable chambers for high-value prisoners to filthy cells for those deemed less important. The prisoners at any given time were a mixed population. Some were nobles imprisoned for their proximity to treachery, real or imagined. Some were merchants or minor officials who had angered the king in some way. Some were clergy who had resisted the king's will in matters of faith. Some were common criminals of sufficient notoriety to merit imprisonment rather than more swift justice. Some were foreign prisoners of war waiting for ransom or negotiation. Each category was treated differently, housed in different locations, allowed different privileges. The hierarchy among prisoners was as strict and as important as the hierarchy among the free. A noble might have a room with a window and the privilege of a servant. A merchant might have a small chamber and the ability to send messages outside the tower. A common criminal might have a cell so small that he could not fully extend his limbs, where the only light came through a narrow slit in the stone. I learned the names and faces of hundreds of prisoners over my years in the tower. Some of them I can still see clearly in my mind as though they are standing before me now. Others have faded into a general blur of suffering faces and desperate eyes. But there are a few whose stories remained with me, whose presence in that place left a mark that has not diminished with time. There was Sir Thomas More, though by the time he came to the tower, he was already a shadow of what he had been. He was imprisoned during the conflict over the king's marriage to Anne Boleyn. More had been the Lord Chancellor of England, a man of considerable learning and faith, but he had refused to acknowledge the king's supremacy over the church. For this, he was brought to the tower. I was not present at his interrogation, but I kept the records of it. I know that he was questioned about his beliefs, that he was asked to declare that the king stood above the Pope in matters of faith, that he refused to do so. He was a man of principle, which is to say he was a man who would not compromise, and compromise was the only currency that mattered in the tower. He was held in the bell tower, in a chamber that was reasonably comfortable by the tower's standards, but I remember the way he moved through it. He had the bearing of someone who was no longer entirely present in the world, as though his mind had already withdrawn from the business of living and was elsewhere. He wrote letters during his imprisonment. I copied some of them myself. Letters to his daughter, reflections on faith and the nature of earthly power. They were remarkable documents, though I did not fully understand their weight at the time. I was simply copying words from his hand to a page, preserving them as required. His final morning came on the 20th of June, 1535. I did not witness what happened, but I was present in the tower when it occurred. There was a strange quiet that morning, a gathering of officials and guards, preparations made with a grim precision. After, there was a cleaning up, an ordering of things, a return to routine. The chamber where he had been held was emptied and cleaned, made ready for the next prisoner. His name was entered in the records as no longer present. Within a few weeks there was barely any trace that he had been there at all, except for the marks that his presence had left on those of us who had known him. The business of the tower was largely concerned with maintaining security and preventing escapes. There were always men who dreamed of freedom, who contemplated the possibility of climbing the walls or overwhelming the guards. There were always visitors coming and going, lawyers, priests, the king's ministers, family members of prisoners bearing gifts or messages. Each of these visits represented a potential opportunity for escape or for the smuggling of information out of the tower. Preventing such occurrences required constant vigilance. The guards who walked the walls were men of moderate competence mostly. They were paid modestly and were often corrupt, willing to allow items to be smuggled in for a price, willing to carry messages outside the tower for coin. This corruption was, in a strange way, part of the official system. The constable knew that it happened. He accepted it as a lesser evil than the alternative, which would have been greater unrest among the prisoners or desperate escape attempts. There was an unspoken understanding that modest corruption was acceptable, but serious betrayal would not be tolerated. I once discovered a guard accepting a large bribe from a visiting merchant who was attempting to pass messages to a prisoner. When I reported this, the guard was beaten and dismissed. The merchant was questioned harshly about his intentions, but within a few weeks another arrangement had been made, and messages were flowing again, though through different channels. The system had a kind of elasticity to it. It adjusted to maintain its fundamental integrity while allowing minor violations. The smell of the tower was perhaps the most enduring memory I carry from those years. It was not a simple smell. It was a layering of odours that accumulated in the stone and became almost solid. There was the smell of damp rising from the chambers below ground where moisture seeped through the walls. There was the smell of human waste which accumulated despite the efforts made to dispose of it. There was the smell of sickness, a sweet, rotten smell that indicated disease. There was the smell of unwashed bodies and unwashed clothes, of fear itself if such a thing has a smell, which I believe it does. There was the smell of iron and rust from the chains and locks, and beneath all of these there was the smell of the river, the Thames just beyond the walls, bringing the scent of water and mud and commerce. I used to scrub my hands and my clothes when I left the tower at the end of each day, but the smell seemed to have entered my very skin. For the first year of my employment, I could not eat properly because everything I consumed seemed to carry that smell. I would sit at my family's table. I married in my second year at the tower to a woman named Catherine, the daughter of a minor court official, and I would feel her watching me, wondering why the food repulsed me. Eventually I adjusted. The smell became simply the ordinary smell of the world. The extraordinary becomes ordinary if you are exposed to it continuously. The day-to-day life of the tower was built on routine. There was a bell that rang at dawn to signal the beginning of the day. The guards changed their watch. The prisoners were inspected to ensure that no one had died during the night, a more frequent occurrence than you might imagine, despite the tower not being the most terrible place of imprisonment in England. The records were updated, the locks were checked, food was distributed, generally a form of bread and weak broth for common prisoners, somewhat better fare for those of higher status. If any prisoner was to be questioned, these sessions generally occurred in the late morning, when the light was strongest. Visitors were admitted at specific hours. The routine was designed to be predictable, to give structure to a place that would otherwise have dissolved into chaos. The questioning of prisoners was a matter of considerable importance, and different approaches were taken depending on the prisoner's status and the reason for their imprisonment. If the prisoner was suspected of conspiracy or treason, the questioning could be quite thorough. There was a room where such interrogations took place, a chamber that was neither very large nor very terrible in its appearance, simply a room with a table and chairs, a fireplace, and a door that could be locked from the outside. But the reputation of this room had grown to be far greater than its physical reality. Men came to dread the questioning, not because of anything that happened in the room itself, but because of what they imagined might happen, what others had told them had happened. I was not present at most of these interrogations, but I kept records of them. I would receive reports from the officers who conducted the questioning, noting what had been asked, what had been revealed, whether the prisoner had cooperated or resisted. I would then make these entries in the great ledger that documented the tower's business. This was my role in the system. I was not the one asking the questions, but I was the one who recorded the answers. This distinction was important to me at the time, though I have come to understand it as a distinction without a real difference. There was one prisoner whose interrogation I do remember with particular clarity. His name was Richard Roos, and he had been brought to the tower in 1532, accused of poisoning the household of the Bishop of London. He was not a man of high status. He was a cook, a servant in the bishop's kitchen, but the crime with which he was charged was extraordinarily serious, and the king had taken a personal interest in the matter. Such a crime threatened the safety of the great lords, and the king would not tolerate the suggestion that such a thing was possible. I remember Roos because he was brought to the tower on the same day that I was sent to verify that the locks on his chamber were secure. He was a small man, middle-aged, with grey in his hair and a face marked by years of labour. He looked at me when I entered his cell, and there was a question in his eyes. He was trying to assess whether I was someone who might help him. Of course, I looked away. I checked the locks, verified that they were secure, and left without speaking to him. His interrogation was extensive. The questions were about his knowledge of poisons, about his access to the food, about whether he had been paid by someone to commit the act. But what struck me about the records of his questioning was not the content of the questions, but the progression. The first few sessions were relatively brief. The interrogators seemed uncertain, seemed to be trying to establish the facts of what had occurred. But as the sessions continued, the questioning became more intense, more focused on extracting a confession rather than discovering the truth. I remember reading one of the later reports and being struck by the contradiction in it. The interrogator had noted that Rose had consistently denied any involvement in the poisoning, that he had claimed to have no knowledge of who had actually committed the act, if indeed anyone had. But the interrogator had concluded that Rose was clearly lying, that he was withholding the names of his accomplices, that it would be necessary to employ sharper means to extract the truth from him. Sharper means. This was the language we used. We did not speak of torture, though that is what it was. We spoke of sharper means, of more intensive questioning, of means necessary to extract the truth. The language created a distance between ourselves and what was actually being done. It allowed us to maintain the fiction that we were engaged in justice, in the extraction of truth, rather than in the infliction of harm. I do not know exactly what happened to Ruse in the room where sharper means were employed. No detailed records were kept of such sessions, or, if they were, I was not provided with them. But I remember the change in him after his interrogation became more intensive. He moved more slowly. He held his body at an angle, as though in pain. The food that was brought to him sat largely untouched. And most tellingly, his demeanour changed. The desperate hope that had been in his eyes during those first days faded. He began to move with the resignation of someone who had accepted his fate. 2 weeks after his interrogation began, I was asked to make a particular entry in the ledger. Rose had confessed to the crime of poisoning the bishop's household. He had admitted that he had been paid to commit the act, though he claimed to have forgotten the name of the man who had paid him. He had agreed to all of this after his interrogation became more intensive. I do not know whether Roos had actually poisoned anyone. The historical accounts suggest that he probably did not, that he was a scapegoat for a crime that was never properly solved. But in the tower, the truth of what he had done mattered less than the fact that he had confessed. A confession was the goal of interrogation, and once a confession was achieved, the matter was considered concluded. His final morning came a few months after his confession. This time, I was informed in advance that something was to happen. I was instructed to accompany the prisoner from the tower to the place of public reckoning. I did not want to go, but I was ordered to go, and I had learned by that point that refusal was not a realistic option. You did not refuse orders in the tower. The journey through London was strange. We were a small procession ruse, myself, 2 guards and a priest. The streets were crowded, and I realized with a shock that many people had turned out to watch. They lined the streets, called out to Rose, hurled insults and threats. It occurred to me in that moment that Rose had become famous, or rather, infamous in the city. The poisoning, the interrogation, the confession, all of it had been known, discussed, become part of the gossip of London, and now they had gathered to witness his end. The place of reckoning was a specific location outside the city, used for such matters. I will not describe what happened there in graphic detail, but I will say that it was terrible in the way that such public spectacles are terrible. What I remember most clearly is not the details of what happened, but the sound, the roar of the crowd, the cries of the condemned man, and underneath it all the constant, steady sound of the Thames, visible in the distance, indifferent to all of this, carrying things away that no one was meant to speak of. I walked back to the tower after it was finished. The guards rode, but I walked. I needed time to think, or perhaps I needed time to not think. The streets of London were still crowded with people discussing what they had witnessed. I heard fragments of conversation as I passed, opinions about whether justice had been served, speculation about whether Rose had actually been guilty, admiration for the way the king maintained order in his realm. By the time I reached the tower, I had begun the work of compartmentalizing what I had witnessed. I had begun the process of telling myself that this was necessary, that such things had to be done in order to maintain order, that I could not afford to become too attached to the individuals who passed through the tower, because that attachment would prevent me from doing my duty. This is the great lie that those who work in systems of power tell themselves. We tell ourselves that what is happening is necessary, that we are not responsible, that we are simply doing our jobs. The years passed. The king's reign continued, marked by his marriages and his religious upheavals. The realm became increasingly unstable as the king's will clashed with the resistance of powerful people who had their own interests and their own views about how things should be ordered. And the tower remained a constant presence, a repository for those who had displeased the king or had become inconvenient to his purposes. I rose in position during these years. I was eventually promoted to Lieutenant of the Tower, a role that gave me greater responsibility and greater authority over the prisoners and the staff. This promotion pleased me at the time. It meant a higher salary, better lodging, greater status, but it also meant greater complicity. As lieutenant, I was no longer simply recording what happened. I was making decisions about how prisoners were to be treated, what privileges they would be allowed, which ones were to be subjected to intensive questioning. I had begun to develop what I can only describe as a philosophy of imprisonment. I believed that order could be maintained through a combination of fairness and firmness. I believed that prisoners who were treated with basic decency were less likely to attempt escape. I believed that providing them with small comforts, a candle to read by, the ability to receive letters from family members, adequate food, actually made the tower a more secure place because it reduced desperation and the desire to escape. This philosophy was not universally popular among the other officers of the tower, but it was effective, and the constable permitted me to implement it because it resulted in fewer problems. I was proud of my management of the tower. I told myself that I was the kind of officer who maintained order through reason rather than through brutality. I told myself that I was better than the other wardens who took pleasure in the suffering of their charges. I told myself that I was, in my own way, a compassionate man doing a difficult job, but I was also making decisions about who should be questioned intensively, who should be denied privileges, who should be confined in the worst cells. I was, in short, still complicit in the system, though I was doing it with a velvet glove rather than an iron fist. And in some ways, this was worse than simple brutality, because it allowed me to maintain the fiction that I was not participating in injustice, that I was simply implementing policy according to reasonable principles. There was one prisoner who crystallized for me the contradiction that I was living with. His name was Henry Courtenay, and he was brought to the tower in 1539, accused of treason. He was a distant cousin of the king, a man of considerable wealth and status, but his status did not protect him. The accusation of treason was sufficient to overcome rank. Courtenay was assigned to the Beauchamp Tower, which was reserved for prisoners of high status. His chamber was relatively comfortable. It had a window overlooking the river, a fireplace, decent furnishings. He was allowed to have visitors during specified hours. His meals were adequate. By the standards of the tower, he was being treated well. But the business of determining whether he was actually guilty of treason, or rather, whether his guilt could be established in a way that the king would find satisfactory, required a process of questioning. Courtenay was a man of considerable intelligence, educated and articulate. He knew the law and understood the charges that had been brought against him. He also understood that the goal of the interrogation was not to determine the truth, but to extract a confession that would satisfy the king and justify his imprisonment and eventual end. I watched this process unfold over a period of several months. Courtenay was questioned repeatedly about his conversations with other nobles, about whether he had been critical of the king, about whether he had spoken with the king's enemies. He was not subjected to intensive interrogation, partly because of his status, partly because I had instructed the interrogators to approach him with more restraint. But the goal was the same as it had been with Rose. The goal was to break him, to force him to say what the king wanted to hear. What struck me about Courtenay was his resilience. He continued to maintain his innocence. He continued to refuse to say things that he did not believe to be true. He continued to treat his interrogators with courtesy and dignity. For weeks, this had no effect. But gradually I began to notice that the other prisoners seemed to be influenced by his behavior. They seemed to take courage from his refusal to be broken. The tower, which should have been a place of despair and resignation, seemed to be developing a sense of resistance, of dignity, almost of defiance. I understood that this was dangerous. The tower's functioning depended on despair, on the acceptance by prisoners that their situation was hopeless, that resistance was futile, if Courtenay's example inspired others to resist, if it created a sense that a man could maintain his dignity and his principles even in the tower, then the entire system was threatened. I made a decision that I have regretted ever since, though the regret is accompanied by an understanding that I did what I believed was necessary at the time. I informed the interrogators that Courtenay was to be subjected to more intensive questioning. I told myself that this was a tactical necessity, that it was required to maintain the functioning of the tower. I told myself that Courtenay was a traitor and deserved whatever happened to him. I told myself all the things that men tell themselves when they participate in the infliction of suffering. What happened to Courtenay after that, I do not know with certainty. The records of intensive interrogation were never kept in detail. But I know that something changed in him. The man who came out of that process was diminished. The dignity that had impressed me was gone. He moved with a kind of dead resignation, as though some essential part of him had been removed. After several more weeks, Courtenay was taken from the tower. His name was removed from the ledger. In the official histories, he is recorded as having been executed for treason, but I do not know if that is what actually happened. I never witnessed it. I simply know that he disappeared from the tower, and that the process of his disappearing had begun with my decision to subject him to intensive questioning. This is the knowledge that haunts me in my final years. I have told myself that I was simply doing my duty, that I was not responsible for what happened to Courtenay, that I was acting in accordance with the law and the orders of the king. But I know in a part of myself that cannot be lied to that I made a choice. I chose to sacrifice Courtenay's dignity and his resistance in order to maintain the system of the tower. I chose complicity. During the years of my employment at the tower, I began to have a recurring dream. In this dream, I was standing on top of the White Tower, looking down at the fortress below me. I could see all of the towers and the walls and the courtyards arranged in their geometric patterns. I could see the river beyond, carrying its traffic of boats and debris, and I could see the ravens that circled constantly around the tower, the black birds that fed on the scraps of the fortress, and that seemed to have become almost part of the structure itself. In the dream, I was watching the ravens circle, and I became aware that there were other birds circling as well, birds that I could not quite see clearly, but whose presence I could sense. These birds were carrying things away, carrying away the names of the prisoners, carrying away the confessions that had been extracted, carrying away the secrets that the tower had absorbed. And as I watched these birds circle, I began to understand that the tower was not really a place of imprisonment at all. It was a place of erasure. It was where inconvenient people were brought to have their names removed from the world, to have their existence erased from the official record, to have the stories of their lives overwritten with the stories that power had decided were true. This dream came repeatedly throughout my years in the tower, and it became more vivid and more disturbing as the years passed. The ravens in the dream became more distinct. The things they were carrying became more clearly identifiable. And the sense that I was not simply observing this process, but was somehow complicit in it, became more overwhelming. In 1547, when I was in my 48th year, King Henry died. A new king came to power, Edward VI, a boy of only 9 years old. The transition caused considerable upheaval at court, and many of the older officers of the king's household were replaced. I was not immediately removed from my position. I had become too established in my role at the tower, and the new regime seemed content to leave such matters in the hands of experienced administrators. But the character of the tower changed under the new government. The boy king's regency was dominated by his uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, and then later by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. These men had their own ambitions and their own enemies. The tower, which should have been a place of security and stability, became a place where the powerful came and went based on the shifting alliances at court. Prisoners who had been confidently imprisoned were suddenly released. New prisoners arrived, often arriving with the accusation that they had conspired against the Duke or had failed to support his policies. I found myself increasingly uncomfortable in my role during this period. The work of imprisoning enemies of the crown had at least had a kind of logic to it. When the king was the source of authority, and his will was expressed through the imprisonment of those who had displeased him, There was a kind of straightforward understanding about what was happening, but when power was contested among multiple factions at court, and the tower became a tool in their conflicts with one another, something more troubling occurred. The tower became a place where private grudges were settled under the cover of accusations of treason. It became a place where the powerful turned on one another, using the fortress and its apparatus of imprisonment as a weapon in their disputes. I began to think more seriously about leaving my position. I'd acquired property outside of London, land that I could manage, and that could provide me with a comfortable retirement. Catherine, my wife, had been urging me for years to leave the tower and to seek a quieter life. We had never had children, whether through misfortune or by deliberate choice I am no longer certain, but we had developed a comfortable relationship, and she was now content with a life of relative domesticity outside the city. But I did not leave. I remained at the tower. I told myself that I was needed, that my presence helped to maintain some standards of fairness and decency in the administration of the fortress. I told myself that if I left, someone worse would replace me, someone who would use the tower more brutally and with less restraint. I told myself all the things that men tell themselves when they continue in work that they know is harmful but from which they have not yet found the courage to walk away. The turning point came in 1553, at the end of the reign of Edward VI. The young king was dying, and a succession crisis was developing. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, had manoeuvred to place his daughter-in-law, Lady Jane Grey, in the line of succession, a move that should have resulted in her becoming queen. But the common people of England and many of the nobility were not willing to accept this. The succession of Mary Tudor, the daughter of Henry VIII by his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon, was seen as more legitimate. The Tower became the centre of a political storm during these months. Lady Jane Grey was brought to the Tower and imprisoned, not as a traitor initially, but as someone whose position in the succession needed to be clarified. Northumberland himself was imprisoned in the Tower after the failure of his plans, and various other nobles who had supported one side or the other were also brought to the fortress. I remember the morning that Lady Jane Grey was brought to the Tower. She was a young woman, not yet 17 years old, but she carried herself with a remarkable composure. She was assigned to a chamber in the Beauchamp Tower in conditions that reflected her status as a prisoner of high birth rather than a traitor. She was permitted to have her husband visit her, and I remember observing their meetings from a distance, struck by the dignity with which they comported themselves, by the love that was evident between them, even in this terrible circumstance. Lady Jane was maintained in the Tower for some months. During this time, Mary Tudor came to power, and the question of what should be done with Lady Jane became a matter of considerable political significance. Mary was inclined toward Mercy Jane, had been manoeuvred into her position by Northumberland and others, and Jane herself had never claimed to want the crown. But Mary's advisers urged her toward a harsher response, arguing that Jane represented a continuing threat and that mercy would be seen as weakness. The political pressure for Jane's execution gradually increased. There were accusations that she was involved in various conspiracies. There were arguments that her continued existence was a focus for resistance to Mary's reign. And eventually, despite Mary's initial inclination toward mercy, the pressure became too great to resist. I was not present at the reckoning. By that time, I had made arrangements to be absent from the Tower on the morning when Jane was to be taken from it. I told myself that I was honouring her memory, that I was refusing to participate in what was happening, that by absenting myself I was taking a stand. But I now understand this for what it was, a cowardly attempt to have it both ways, to participate in a system while pretending that I was not participating in it, to maintain my position and my comfort while disavowing the consequences of that position. Her death was widely known and mourned, particularly after Mary's reign gave way to that of Elizabeth. Jane came to be seen as a martyr, as a symbol of innocence sacrificed to political necessity. But at the time she died, she was simply another prisoner who had ceased to be present in the Tower, another name that was removed from the ledger, another person whose existence had been erased. After that, I knew that I could not continue. I could not maintain the fiction that what I was doing was necessary, that I was serving justice, that I was a compassionate man doing a difficult job. I had finally understood that I was participating in a system that was fundamentally unjust, that was predicated on the use of force and imprisonment to maintain the power of those who already held power, that was designed to crush those who resisted or who simply had the misfortune of displeasing the powerful. I submitted my resignation and retired to my property outside London. I was 61 years old. I had spent more than half of my life in the tower, and I was finally leaving it behind. The first months after my retirement were strange. I found myself unused to silence, to the absence of the sounds of the tower, the clanging of iron, the footsteps on stone, the crying of prisoners. The house that Catherine and I occupied was peaceful, but the peace felt unnatural to me. I had been shaped by decades of the tower, and I did not quite know how to be anything else. I began to spend time trying to make sense of what I had done. I had kept extensive notes and records throughout my years in the tower years of observations about the prisoners, the staff, the daily operations of the fortress. I began to review these notes, trying to understand if there was anything that I had missed, any moment at which I could have made a different choice, any way in which I could have acted differently. But what I found, in reviewing these notes, was that the system had been working exactly as it was designed to work. The tower was not a place of aberration or exception. It was a rational, functioning apparatus designed to accomplish specific ends. Those ends were to remove from society people who were seen as threats to the established order, to extract information from them if such extraction was deemed necessary, and to ensure that they could not represent a continuing threat. The system was brutal, but it was not chaotic. It was unjust, but it was not irrational. It was designed and implemented by people like me, people who believed they were serving necessary purposes, people who were not themselves cruel, but who participated in a system of cruelty. I came to understand that what had happened in the tower was not an exception to the normal functioning of power. It was the normal functioning of power revealed in its essential form. The tower was simply more obvious about what it was doing than many other institutions of power. It was not hypocritical about the fact that it used force to maintain order, but the force that was used in the tower was continuous with the force that was used everywhere else in the society, in the enforcement of property rights, in the maintenance of the hierarchy, in the prevention of resistance to the established order. The dream returned to me in my retirement, but it had changed. I was still standing on top of the White Tower, looking down at the fortress below, but now I understood what the ravens were carrying. They were carrying away the lives of the prisoners, carrying away the dignity of the people who were confined, carrying away the possibility that anyone could resist or refuse the order that had been imposed upon them. And I understood that I was not simply observing this process from outside. I was part of the mechanism by which it happened. Catherine died in 1562, having lived to see the beginning of Elizabeth's reign. She had been a good woman, and I had loved her as well as I was capable of loving anyone by that point in my life. But I had never fully shared with her the weight of what I carried from my years in the tower. She knew, of course, what I had done. Everyone in our circle knew. But we had developed an agreement, unspoken but clear, that certain things would not be discussed between us. She had asked me, during our final months together, whether I regretted what I had done. I remember standing at the window of our house, looking out toward the distance where the tower stood invisible but always present, and I remember telling her that I did not know, that I could not distinguish between regret and simple exhaustion, between a genuine wish that things had been different and a desire to have not had to carry what I had been forced to carry. After Catherine's death, I found myself increasingly alone. The years continued to pass. I was no longer a young man. My hands began to fail me, my father's hands, I realized, beginning their own decline toward uselessness. My hearing faded further. I developed the aches and pains that come to all men eventually, the sense that the body is slowly ceasing to function properly, that death is an approaching event rather than a distant abstraction. I spent my final years attempting to set down an account of what I had witnessed in the tower. This was partly for myself to try to make some sense of it all, but it was also, I believe, a form of confession. I wanted there to be a record somewhere of what had actually happened, not the official histories, which presented the tower as a place of necessary justice, where traitors and threats to the crown were properly dealt with, but the actual record of what it had been like to live within those walls, to participate in the system that had been constructed there, to be a part of the machinery through which lives were ended and dignity was erased. I've read accounts of the tower written by men who were prisoners there. Some of them are eloquent and moving, bearing witness to suffering with a clarity that I find moving even now. But what struck me about these accounts is that they tell only part of the story. They tell of the prisoner's experience, but they do not tell of the experience of those of us who kept them, who maintained the system, who were not themselves suffering, but who were nonetheless shaped by the work of inflicting suffering. There was one prisoner whose account I was particularly struck by. His name was William Tyndale, though he was not imprisoned in the tower but rather in Vilvoorde, in what is now Belgium. But the circumstances of his imprisonment were similar to what occurred in the tower. He had been imprisoned for his resistance to the authorities, for his refusal to acknowledge the supremacy of the established order. In his account, written while he was imprisoned, he spoke of the guards who kept him, and he spoke of them without hatred. He recognized them as men like himself, men who were doing work that they had been assigned to do, men who were operating within a system that they had not created and that they could not easily escape. His final prayer, it is recorded, was not for vengeance against those who had imprisoned him, but for mercy for his jailers. He asked God to forgive them for what they were doing, recognizing that they were, in their own way, victims of the same system that was victimizing him. I do not know if I deserved such mercy. I've spent my final decades wrestling with this question, and I have not arrived at a satisfactory answer. I was not a brutal man. I did not take pleasure in the suffering of prisoners. In fact, I attempted to mitigate their suffering where I could, to provide them with small comforts, to treat them with basic human dignity. But I also recognized that I was complicit in their imprisonment, that my attempts at kindness did not erase the fundamental injustice of what was happening. There was a young prisoner who came to the tower in 1551. He was brought in for sedition. He had been part of a group that had been spreading what were deemed to be dangerous ideas about the distribution of property and the equality of men. He was not a man of high status, and he was not subjected to intensive interrogation. But he was kept in one of the less comfortable cells, and I had occasion to see him regularly as I made my rounds. What struck me about this young man was his hope. Despite his circumstances, despite the fact that he had no reason to believe that anything good would come to him, he maintained a kind of optimism, a conviction that eventually justice would prevail, that the world would be made right. He had been imprisoned for his beliefs, but his imprisonment had not destroyed his beliefs. He still spoke, when he was allowed to speak, about the possibility of a more just world. I engaged him in conversation one day, breaking the strict rules that governed such interactions. He told me about the ideas that had led to his imprisonment. He spoke of them with a passion that I had not encountered in a long time, a passion born not from bitterness or resentment, but from a genuine conviction that the world could be better than it was. I asked him what he thought would happen to him, whether he did not fear what might come. He told me that he did fear it, that he was not brave enough to claim otherwise. But he also said that he had come to understand that his own fate mattered less than whether the ideas that he had been willing to die for might eventually come to be accepted by others. He said that if he could contribute to the eventual liberation of people like himself, people born into servitude, people without property or status, people whose lives were not their own, then his own suffering and his own death would have meaning. I remember being profoundly affected by this conversation. I remember thinking that this young man had found something that I had never been able to find, a sense that his life had meaning beyond the immediate circumstances of his existence, that there was something larger than himself to which he could devote himself. This prisoner was eventually released. I never discovered why. His name simply disappeared from the rolls, and I assumed that he had been allowed to leave. I hoped at the time that he had been freed, that he had survived his imprisonment and would live to see the better world that he believed was coming. But I have never known for certain what happened to him. The dream of the tower and the ravens continued to visit me long after I had left my position. But as I aged, the dream began to change once more. In the final years before my death, the dream shifted. I was no longer standing on top of the White Tower looking down. Instead, I was standing inside the fortress, walking through corridors that I'd walked hundreds of times before. But the prisoners were no longer confined to their cells. They were walking freely, moving through the halls, their faces no longer marked by despair or resignation, but by a kind of peaceful acceptance. The ravens were still circling outside the walls, but they were no longer carrying anything away. They were simply birds, simply creatures of the world, no longer symbols of erasure. And I understood in these final dreams that the tower itself was becoming just a building. It was losing the power that it had held over my life and over the lives of those who had been imprisoned there. Time and memory were transforming it into something ordinary, something that could be understood simply as a place where certain things had happened, rather than as an evil or a curse. I have come to believe in my final years that this is how the worst things in the world persist, not through the malice of bad men, but through the complicity of ordinary men who believe themselves to be reasonable, who tell themselves stories about necessity and order, who participate in systems of cruelty while maintaining that they are not cruel. The tower could not have functioned without men like me, men who were not themselves sadists or torturers, but who maintained the systems through which sadism and torture became possible. I have been asked by a few people who have known something of what I am setting down here, whether I believe that I deserve to be punished for my role in what happened in the tower. This is a question that I have not been able to answer with certainty. What would just punishment for my complicity look like? Should I have been imprisoned? Should I have been subjected to some form of trial? Or is the punishment simply that I have had to live with the knowledge of what I did, that I have had to carry the weight of it through decades of life? I believe now that there is no adequate punishment for such complicity. There is only the fact of it, the reality of what I did and what I participated in, and the knowledge that I cannot change that or erase it. I can only acknowledge it and bear witness to it. The Tower of London stands still, as it has stood for centuries. It has been transformed over the years, repurposed, reimagined. It is no longer a place of imprisonment in the way that it was during my time there. But it remains a monument to what human beings are capable of doing to one another, and to the ways in which ordinary men participate in extraordinary cruelty. I am 87 years old now, and I do not believe that I have many years left to live. I have set down this account not to seek forgiveness, for I do not believe that I deserve it, but to bear witness to what I have seen and what I have done. I have tried to be honest about my own complicity, to avoid the easy self-deception of claiming that I was simply following orders or that I was powerless to resist. I was a man who made choices, and those choices had consequences. If there is a lesson to be drawn from what I have witnessed, it is this: that the machinery of cruelty cannot function without the cooperation of ordinary men, that systems of injustice persist not because of the wickedness of those who lead them, but because of the willingness of people in positions of lesser power to participate in them, that silence and complicity are the same thing, that to know of suffering and to do nothing is to participate in that suffering. I think often now of the young man who came to the tower imprisoned for sedition, who maintained his hope that a more just world was possible. I do not know what became of him. I do not know if his hopes were justified, if the world has indeed become more just, or if it has simply found new forms of injustice, new ways of maintaining the power of some over others. But I have come to believe that he was right about one thing: that individual lives can have meaning even in the face of injustice, that suffering can be endured with dignity if one maintains a vision of something larger than oneself, that the tower, both the actual fortress and the systems of power that it represented, is not eternal, that time and memory transform it into something that can finally be understood clearly. The ravens have stopped coming to my dreams. In the final dreams, before the dreams ceased altogether, I saw only the empty stone, the vast walls, the grey water of the Thames flowing past without memory. The tower had become simply a building, and the secrets that it held had been finally released into time and forgotten. My name is Richard Ashford. I was a warden of the Tower of London for more than 30 years. I kept prisoners. I maintained records. I participated in a system that was designed to crush human dignity and to maintain the power of those who already held power. I was not a cruel man, but I was a complicit one. This is the only truth I can leave behind. It was not cruelty that built the tower. It was fear. The fear of the powerful, that those beneath them might rise up, might resist, might demand something different, from what had been given to them. And that fear required the construction of systems to manage and contain that resistance. The tower was one such system. There have been and will be many others. The only thing that can defeat such systems is the courage of ordinary people to refuse to participate in them, to refuse to tell themselves stories about necessity and order, to recognize that complicity is a choice, and that they have the power to choose differently. I did not have that courage. I participated in the system for 32 years before I found the strength to walk away. I have spent the remaining years of my life trying to understand that failure, trying to set down an honest account of what I did and what I failed to do. This is my confession. This is my witness to what the tower held, what the tower did, and what I was part of in allowing it to do those things. It is not redemption. It is simply the truth, offered too late to change anything, but offered nonetheless. The water of the Thames flows still past those grey walls. The ravens circle still in the sky above the fortress. The stones remember what happened within their bounds, even if those who built them and maintained them have turned to dust and been forgotten. The tower stands, and it waits for the next men who will keep its secrets, who will maintain its systems, who will tell themselves stories about necessity and order until they finally understand, if they are fortunate enough to live long enough, what they have been a part of. This is what I have to say. This is what I have witnessed. This is what I have done. May those who read this understand it better than I did, and may they choose differently when they face their own moment of decision.